It was a busy Friday evening at Bella's Bistro, a cozy yet popular restaurant known for its fine dining and exceptional service. The staff was hustling to meet the high demand of patrons as the dim lights flickered softly, creating an intimate atmosphere. At the front, a young waiter named Tim was handling the influx of customers, trying to maintain a calm composure despite the overwhelming crowd. Tim had been working at Bella's Bistro for a few months, and though he was new to the job, he had quickly learned how to manage the rush. His job was simple: seat customers, take orders, and ensure the restaurant ran smoothly. Tim prided himself on being quick and efficient, often rushing through his duties with little thought about the people sitting at the tables. One evening, a woman walked in alone, dressed in an elegant but simple black dress that suggested a quiet sophistication. Her hair was neatly styled, and she carried herself with a sense of confidence that seemed to make others step aside. Tim glanced up from his clipboard and took note of her arrival, thinking she looked out of place compared to the usual crowd. She was a woman in her mid-30s, and while her demeanor didn't suggest she was in a hurry, there was an air of urgency in her step. "Table for one?" Tim asked, barely looking up from his station. "Yes, please," the woman replied, her voice smooth and calm. "I don't mind where I sit." Tim, in his rush to attend to other customers, nodded curtly and pointed toward a table near the back of the restaurant, far from the busy center. "You can sit over there," he said, not taking into account the fact that the table was positioned in a dimly lit corner, far from the lively atmosphere of the main dining area. The woman hesitated for a moment before nodding and walking toward the table. Tim watched her go, but didn't pay much attention to her after that. She sat down quietly, glancing around the restaurant, but no one approached her right away. It wasn't until a few minutes passed that Tim finally made his way over to take her order, irritated by the fact that he had several more tables to manage. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, his tone somewhat detached. "Just water for now. Thank you," she replied politely, smiling warmly despite Tim's cold approach. Tim hurried off to grab the water, not giving her much thought. However, as he served it to her, he noticed her eyes scanning the room thoughtfully, as if she were trying to observe everything around her. She didn't seem like the kind of customer who was looking for attention, but there was something about her presence that seemed to shift the energy in the room. Unbeknownst to Tim, this woman was far from just another diner. She was, in fact, the owner of Bella's Bistro, having just returned after a long business trip. She had been overseeing the opening of a new location and wanted to get a feel for how the staff was treating the restaurant's regular customers, all while remaining anonymous. But Tim, too caught up in his own rush and his preconceptions of what a typical customer should be, failed to recognize her significance. As the night wore on, Tim continued his usual routine, moving from table to table, barely sparing the woman in the corner another glance. Despite the warmth of her smile when they had first interacted, Tim was oblivious to the fact that his behavior was starting to irk her. She had been waiting for a considerable amount of time for someone to check in on her, and it wasn't until another 20 minutes passed that the situation began to escalate. The restaurant was busy, and Tim was clearly overwhelmed. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere grew tense. Tim's movements became more frantic as he tried to juggle orders, clear tables, and make sure everything was running smoothly. Yet, amidst all the chaos, he kept ignoring the woman's table, convinced she was just another quiet diner not in need of much attention. Finally, the woman's patience ran out. She politely caught Tim's attention when he walked by her table again, moving quickly with a stack of plates. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been sitting here for almost an hour. Is there a reason no one has checked on me yet?" Tim, caught off guard by the gentle but pointed question, blinked at her. He hadn't expected her to speak up, especially after her calm demeanor when she first entered. His irritation bubbled to the surface, and he answered brusquely, "Sorry, it's a busy night. I'll get to you when I can." The woman's eyebrows furrowed, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she waited in silence. The exchange wasn't dramatic, but there was a clear sense that Tim was brushing her off. The woman's patience began to thin. She had come back to the restaurant, hoping for a quiet night out without fanfare, but now she was beginning to question the professionalism of the staff. The lack of attention made her feel invisible, as if she didn't matter in a space that she had poured years of effort into building. She had seen countless customers treated with respect and dignity, but tonight, she felt like an afterthought. Meanwhile, Tim continued his rounds, not once thinking that this woman could be the one who owned the very restaurant he worked at. He was too preoccupied with the bustling crowd to notice the details around him. The busy night had made him careless, and the woman's polite yet direct question didn't break through his mental fog. It wasn't until a few more minutes passed that the situation escalated further. Tim's frustration grew as the night wore on, and the last thing he expected was a quiet, seemingly harmless woman questioning him in front of other diners. But when he finally did approach her again, it was not to apologize or offer a drink refill. It was to hurry her along, ready to clear her table. "Are you done?" he asked with little tact. "I need to make room for more customers." The woman stared at him, her expression now unreadable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cool. "You're telling me to leave?" Tim, oblivious to the shift in her tone, nodded curtly. "Yes, there are other people waiting." It was at that moment that everything shifted. The woman stood up slowly, making sure to meet Tim's gaze. Her calm, collected exterior hid the mounting anger and disappointment within her. But before she could say anything further, a voice called from across the restaurant. "Tim, what's going on here?" It was Carla, the restaurant's manager, rushing over from the kitchen, her eyes wide with concern. The woman turned to Carla, who now stood by her side, catching the tail end of the exchange. She spoke calmly, but there was a clear authority in her voice. "I believe your waiter just tried to tell me to leave," she said, her tone calm but firm, the last vestiges of her patience drained. Carla's eyes widened in shock, glancing at Tim, then back at the woman. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," Carla began, her face turning red as she recognized the woman standing before her. Tim's confusion deepened as Carla continued. You're Mrs. Bellamy, aren't you?" The woman nodded, her expression unchanging. "Yes, I am," she said simply. Tim's eyes widened as realization dawned on him. The woman he had been so dismissive toward wasn't just another customer. She was the owner of Bella's Bistro. Carla quickly turned to Tim, her face filled with disappointment. "Do you realize who you've been speaking to?" Tim, now pale and mortified, could barely form words. He stammered, I didn't know. I didn't recognize you." The woman smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. Clearly, the room grew still as the other customers, sensing the tension, quietly watched the unfolding drama. Tim, suddenly aware of the magnitude of his mistake, stood frozen, unsure of how to fix the damage he had already done. Mrs. Bellamy turned to Carla. "I'll handle this," she said softly, her voice taking on an even more authoritative tone. Carla hesitated, but nodded and stepped away, leaving Tim standing awkwardly in front of the woman he had disrespected. The woman sighed, her eyes briefly meeting Tim's. "Perhaps it's time you learned the true value of customer service." The restaurant was buzzing with whispers as Tim stood there, still in a daze, trying to process the weight of what had just happened. Mrs. Bellamy's presence loomed larger now, her identity no longer a quiet mystery. She wasn't just any patron, but the very person who had built Bella's Bistro from the ground up. As he tried to apologize, the words felt inadequate. Mrs. Bellamy didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a moment to observe the restaurant around her. The same space she had spent years carefully crafting, the one she had poured countless hours and resources into making a success. Tim could feel the tension in the air. The guests at nearby tables seemed to watch intently, sensing something important was happening. Tim opened his mouth again, trying to find the right words, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "Look, Tim," Mrs. Bellamy began, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not upset that you didn't recognize me. I'm not upset that you were busy, or that you were overwhelmed by the rush. That happens." She paused, watching him carefully. "What bothers me is that you didn't recognize the value of treating every customer with respect, no matter who they are." Tim's face flushed crimson. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I was just trying to get through the night. It's been so busy, and I didn't think." Mrs. Bellamy nodded, cutting him off once again. "Exactly. You didn't think. You were so focused on serving the people you thought were important that you forgot the core of what we do here. Every customer is important, Tim. Every single one. This restaurant isn't just a business. It's a space where people come to feel valued, to feel cared for. Whether they're a regular or a first-timer, whether they're rich or poor, young or old, it doesn't matter. They come here to feel like they matter." Tim swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always thought of his job as just a way to earn a paycheck, never realizing the deeper purpose behind the service he provided. But standing there now, in front of the very person who had made it all possible, he understood that there was far more to it than just the food or the transactions. Mrs. Bellamy's eyes softened as she saw the genuine remorse on his face. "I'm not here to fire you or make an example of you, but you need to understand that in this business, respect and kindness are not optional, they're required. You will not last long here if you don't make that a part of who you are as a person, not just a worker." Tim nodded earnestly. "I understand. I'm sorry for how I treated you. It wasn't right." She smiled faintly, her earlier firmness softening. "I appreciate that, Tim. But don't just apologize to me. Apologize to your customers. They're the ones who keep this place running." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. Tim watched her leave, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined a simple, seemingly ordinary night at work would turn into a turning point in his life. Later that evening, after the dinner rush had calmed down, Carla called Tim into the office. She didn't look angry, but there was a sense of seriousness in her expression. She handed him a small note and a coffee cup. "You'll find a list of customers who were sitting near Mrs. Bellamy tonight," Carla said. "You're going to call them tomorrow and personally apologize for the way you treated them. It's not going to be easy, but it's something you need to do." Tim took the note, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "I will," he replied, his voice quiet but determined. The next morning, Tim went through the list of customers, dialing one number after another, crafting his apologies with care. He felt nervous, each conversation more uncomfortable than the last, but he made it through. By the end of the day, something had changed in him. He had learned a valuable lesson, not just about his job, but about human connection and the importance of treating others with dignity. Weeks later, as Tim settled into his new routine, he began to notice something unexpected. Customers, even the regulars, started responding to him differently. He wasn't just the young waiter who took orders and delivered meals. He was a part of the atmosphere, an integral piece of the experience. His relationships with the other staff improved as well. His colleagues respected him more because they could see that he had genuinely changed. And as for Mrs. Bellamy, she returned to Bella's Bistro several times after that night, but each time she greeted Tim with a warm smile and a nod of approval. She never mentioned the incident again, but Tim knew that she had been watching. It wasn't until several months later that Tim learned something that would stay with him forever. He was at work one evening when a regular customer, a middle-aged man who had often been a bit distant with him, stopped him as he was clearing a table. "You've really turned around," the man said, giving him a small but approving smile. "You're doing a great job. Keep it up." Tim, who had learned to appreciate these small moments, smiled back. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate that." It was a simple interaction, but to Tim, it was a reminder of how far he had come. He had learned the hard way, but now he understood the value of every customer, every interaction, and every opportunity to make someone feel important. As for Mrs. Bellamy, her quiet lesson had become the cornerstone of Tim's approach to work and to life.